Chapter 14, Part 1 of Sons and Lovers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 14, The Release. "By the way," said Dr. Ansell one evening when Morel was in Sheffield, "we've got a man in the fever hospital here who comes from Nottingham. Dawes. He doesn't seem to have many belongings in this world." "Baxter Dawes!" Paul exclaimed. "That's the man. Has been a fine fellow, physically, I should think. Been in a bit of a mess lately. You know him?" "He used to work at the place where I am." "Did he? Do you know anything about him? He's just sulking, or he'd be a lot better than he is by now." "I don't know anything of his home circumstances, except that he's separated from his wife and has been a bit down, I think. But tell him about me, will you? Tell him I'll come and see him." The next time Morel saw the doctor, he said, "And what about Dawes?" "I said to him," answered the other, "Do you know a man from Nottingham named Morel?" And he looked at me as if he'd jump at my throat. So I said, "I see you know the name. It's Paul Morel." Then I told him about your saying you would go and see him. "What does he want?" he said, as if you were a policeman. "And did he say he would see me?" asked Paul. "He wouldn't say anything, good, bad, or indifferent," replied the doctor. "Why not?" "That's what I want to know. There he lies and sulks, day in, day out. Can't get a word of information out of him." "Do you think I might go?" asked Paul. "You might." There was a feeling of connection between the rival men, more than ever since they had fought. In a way, Morel felt guilty towards the other, and more or less responsible. And being in such a state of soul himself, he felt an almost painful nearness to Dawes, who was suffering and despairing too. Besides, they had met in a naked extremity of hate, and it was a bond. At any rate, the elemental man in each had met. He went down to the isolation hospital with Dr. Ansell's card. This sister, a healthy young Irishwoman, led him down the ward. "A visitor to see you, Jim Crow," she said. Dawes turned over suddenly with a startled grunt. "Eh?" "Caw," she mocked. "He can only say caw. I have brought you a gentleman to see you. Now say thank you, and show some manners." Dawes looked swiftly with his dark, startled eyes beyond the sister at Paul. His look was full of fear, mistrust, hate, and misery. Morel met the swift dark eyes and hesitated. The two men were afraid of the naked selves they had been. "Dr. Ansell told me you were here," said Morel, holding out his hand. Dawes mechanically shook hands. "So I thought I'd come in," continued Paul. There was no answer. Dawes lay staring at the opposite wall. "Say caw," mocked the nurse. "Say caw, Jim Crow." "He is getting on all right?" said Paul to her. "Oh, yes, he lies and imagines he's going to die," said the nurse, "and it frightens every word out of his mouth." "And you must have somebody to talk to," laughed Morel. "That's it," laughed the nurse. "Only two old men and a boy who always cries. It is hard lines. Here am I dying to hear Jim Crow's voice, and nothing but an odd caw will he give." "So rough on you," said Morel. "Isn't it?" said the nurse. "I suppose I am a godsend," he laughed. "Oh, dropped straight from heaven," laughed the nurse. Presently she left the two men alone. Dawes was thinner and handsome again, but life seemed low in him. As the doctor said, he was lying sulking, and would not move forward towards convalescence. He seemed to grudge every beat of his heart. "Have you had a bad time?" asked Paul. Suddenly again Dawes looked at him. "What are you doing in Sheffield?" he asked. "My mother was taken ill at my sister's in Thurston Street. What are you doing here?" There was no answer. "How long have you been in?" Morel asked. "I couldn't say for sure," Dawes answered grudgingly. He lay staring across at the wall opposite, as if trying to believe Morel was not there. Paul felt his heart go hard and angry. "Dr. Ansell told me you were here," he said coldly. The other man did not answer. "Typhoid's pretty bad, I know," Morel persisted. Suddenly Dawes said, "What did you come for?" "Because Dr. Ansell said you didn't know anybody here. Do you?" "I know nobody nowhere," said Dawes. "Well," said Paul, "it's because you don't choose to, then." There was another silence. "We shall be taking my mother home as soon as we can," said Paul. "What's the matter with her?" asked Dawes, with a sick man's interest in illness. "She's got a cancer." There was another silence. "But we want to get her home," said Paul. "We shall have to get a motor car." Dawes lay thinking. "Why don't you ask Thomas Jordan to lend you his?" said Dawes. "It's not big enough," Morel answered. Dawes blinked his dark eyes as he lay thinking. "Then ask Jack Pilkington. He'll lend it you. You know him." "I think I shall hire one," said Paul. "You're a fool if you do," said Dawes. The sick man was gaunt and handsome again. Paul was sorry for him because his eyes looked so tired. "Did you get a job here?" he asked. "I was only here a day or two before I was taken bad," Dawes replied. "You want to get in a convalescent home," said Paul. The other's face clouded again. "I'm goin' in no convalescent home," he said. "My father's been in the one at Seathorpe, and he liked it. Dr. Ansell would get you a recommend." Dawes lay thinking. It was evident he dared not face the world again. "The seaside would be all right just now," Morel said. "Sun on those sandhills and the waves not far out." The other did not answer. "By gad," Paul concluded, too miserable to bother much, "it's all right when you know you're going to walk again, and swim." Dawes glanced at him quickly. The man's dark eyes were afraid to meet any other eyes in the world, but the real misery and helplessness in Paul's tone gave him a feeling of relief. "Is she far gone?" he asked. "She's going like wax," Paul answered. "But cheerful, lively." He bit his lip. After a moment he rose. "Well, I'll be goin'," he said. "I'll leave you this half-crown." "I don't want it," Dawes muttered. Morel did not answer, but left the coin on the table. "Well," he said, "I'll try and run in when I'm back in Sheffield. Happen you might like to see my brother-in-law? He works in Pycroft's." "I don't know him," said Dawes. "He's all right. Shall I tell him to come? He might bring you some papers to look at." The other man did not answer. Paul went. The strong emotion that Dawes roused in him, repressed, made him shiver. He did not tell his mother, but next day he spoke to Clara about this interview. It was in the dinner hour. The two did not often go out together now, but this day he asked her to go with him to the castle grounds. There they sat while the scarlet geraniums and the yellow calceolarias blazed in the sunlight. She was now always rather protective, and rather resentful towards him. "Did you know Baxter was in Sheffield Hospital with typhoid?" he asked. She looked at him with startled grey eyes, and her face went pale. "No," she said, frightened. "He's getting better. I went to see him yesterday. The doctor told me." Clara seemed stricken by the news. "Is he very bad?" she asked guiltily. "He has been. He's mending now." "What did he say to you?" "Oh, nothing. He seems to be sulking." There was a distance between the two of them. He gave her more information. She went about shut up and silent. The next time they took a walk together, she disengaged herself